Hey, welcome. We are live now. All right, wonderful. Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to our live monthly Q&A. The purpose of this live stream is to connect with you and chat about interesting topics that we talk about on our podcast. So first we release our podcast episode, and then we do a live discussion a couple of weeks later with our guest to make it more interactive so that we can hear from you, interact with you, and you can get your questions answered live. So today's topic is all about how to craft a career in the social impact industry. So as always, let us know where you're joining from. Type in the comments. We'd love to hear from all of our viewers, where you're typing in, where you're calling in from before we get started. So why did we choose this topic this week? So in order to book a call with us at Soul Career, we ask you to take the Myers-Briggs type indicator at 16personalities.com first. So we've done about 250 calls in the last 8 months. And by far, the largest percentage of calls are from people with an F type, the feeling in their personality types based on Myers-Briggs. So this month, we're actually exploring careers that F types are drawn to, starting with mission-driven careers. And today, I have the immense pleasure of being joined by my mentor, Yasmina Zaidman, who is a Chief Partnerships Officer at Acumen, a global nonprofit that tackles poverty through impact investing in social entrepreneurs. Welcome, Yasmina.
Hi, great to be here.
Great to have you on. So we did a lot in our, we covered a lot in our podcast episode, and I don't want to ask the same questions. So I want to touch on things that we didn't get a chance to dive into on that episode to start. So first is the pandemic and how that's really impacted the world of philanthropy and giving, because as a Chief Partnerships Officer, you work a lot with corporate philanthropy, right? So how has the pandemic changed what corporate philanthropists are looking to, donate to and fund?
Yeah, we've seen, because we get to work with a whole suite of donors, from corporate philanthropists, government funders, foundations, and individuals. We've had a chance to see kind of how that whole landscape has evolved. I think we've seen some really beautiful things. We've seen a willingness to be flexible and to respond with urgency and recognize that people need to be able to pivot at this time in order to survive the shocks that come along with the pandemic. And we've also seen some darker things. We've seen people being averse to risk just with the uncertainty of this time. We've also seen the economic effects impact different funders, forcing them to become more restrictive in what they can support. So we've kind of seen the whole spectrum, but I think in any conversation with donors, it's always been about just really understanding what this means to them. How has this impacted them? What is it like for people in that company to go through this, because they're human beings? And also to understand what their priorities are, whether it's, safeguarding the work of their current partners or busting out and trying new things at a time of change. And as always, having that dialogue and understanding what's going on.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So do you see any big trends in 2021 or even coming out of the pandemic beyond 2021 that donors are really looking to invest in?
Well, we've seen trends related not only to the pandemic and the way that it exposed vulnerabilities that were always there, but suddenly were really heightened, seeing the consequences of lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to secure employment, and how hard that has hit vulnerable communities. But there's another really powerful trend that's been happening related to the Black Lives Matter movement and its upsurgence, in the U.S. and globally. And I think, to me, the twin trends are around inclusion and resilience, and the idea that as we think of rebuilding and responding to this, that we have to do it with this lens of how do we help organizations and individuals be stronger in the face of shocks, and how do we build a more inclusive ecosystem where it's not the usual suspects that have the opportunity to get support and to respond in situations like this, but that we're pulling in new voices and listening in new ways.
Absolutely. And definitely, especially last year, we saw a huge wave of support shift into diversity and equity and inclusion. Are you hopeful that that will yield real change? Or, a big part of the debate is that, it's just going to be lip service and not real change in that space. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm an optimist, and I have to think that that there is a real opportunity for change. I guess it's a question of scale, how deep it will go, how long it will last. But I feel like I've already seen, in many ways, some real changes in how people think of their own strategy and how they allocate funding and how people hold themselves accountable. So I think it's happening. It's just a question of whether we'll get to where we really want to be quickly, and if we can maintain that momentum. This needs to be more than just a sort of passing trend, but really a commitment to working differently and saying this is really about bringing everyone forward to do impact work, not just benefit from it, but also to lead it. So people are talking about, who is involved in governance of philanthropy,
Yeah.
who is making decisions about allocation of capital, who weighs in, how are different voices taken into account. And those changes take time, but I do think that it isn't something that we're going to, I think, see disappear, quickly, because it's just needed. It's needed badly, and we've seen the cost of having a system that overlooks the needs of vulnerable and marginalized people really systematically.
Yeah, and this really makes me think of one of the downsides of the social impact space, not just from a diversity perspective, but in terms of securing funding as a small program or even a large program, and how funding is allocated and whether you can separate yourself from the noise, of people who are all looking for funding from similar philanthropic organizations. That was a challenge that I was working on at the Branson Center. How do we attract more people and tell our story in a more effective way? So that brings me to the question of how do you as a corporate fundraiser or as a fundraiser working with corporate philanthropists and other donors, how do you attract their attention and get them to part with their money?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I had like a magic formula. I think that over the past probably more than 10 years, there's been an effort to shift the conversation from, you have a lot, you should give back. These are good causes, they deserve support, which I think is a very limiting view of, worthiness, towards a conversation about really creating strategic value based on values,
Yeah.
to achieve shared goals. So again, if the job of solving poverty and protecting the environment is the job of a small group of well-intentioned NGOs, it's really a losing proposition. But as we embrace that is the role of every institution, suddenly people can ask themselves, where am I best placed to have impact in ways that center people and the planet? And who should I be working with to complement my strengths? So if you do sit in a nonprofit organization, as I do, you say, okay, who can I really bring value to in this work? So find the people that care about the same work that I do and where I have complementary strengths. So maybe they have capital, maybe they have certain skill sets, technologies, even products, and maybe I have boots on the ground, local networks, and a certain set of tools I can use. So how do we bring those things together to solve the problem? And you have to make the case. You have to really understand how your organization can help add value and who are the stakeholders that you're working with. It's, I think, increasingly dangerous to think, I want to do something really, really good for the world, and I'm deserving of funding because of that good intent. That, to me, you really risk isolation. Because at this day and age, everybody has an opportunity to care about what's going on in the world and to figure out, how do you put the pieces in place together to solve that problem, whether you're a for-profit, nonprofit, investor, donor, policymaker, etc.
Exactly. And I remember a couple of years ago, we both work in the social entrepreneurship space, using entrepreneurship to tackle these big problems. But as climate change became a more pressing concern, and now this year and last year, when healthcare became such a pressing concern, the interest I found in entrepreneurship was not as strong. Like all the interest had shifted to kind of climate and these more current topics. Are you seeing that, or are you still getting a lot of interest in the entrepreneurship and poverty reduction kind of area?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that the entrepreneurship space itself has evolved, and what that means, whether you're talking about a micro entrepreneur who's really just someone who's using entrepreneurship to come out of poverty, or you're talking about a social business that could operate at a really large scale, that could be an international company that is taking on, say, an environmental challenge or a supply chain challenge. And there's kind of everything in between. So the language of entrepreneurship is almost not as useful anymore. So to me, it's also this conversation about the role of using market-based solutions versus other models, which may be more focused on systems of democracy, governance, and policy. And the reality is we absolutely need both.
Yeah.
And it isn't an either or. We can't replace the weaknesses in democratic institutions with entrepreneurship. And we've seen in the US that having trust in institutions and strong democratic systems is fundamentally important to kind of anything that we want to do, and to having the government play the right role in a way that is inclusive and representative of people's needs. At the same time, markets aren't going away. And while some feel that capitalism is the source of our problems, we've been talking more and more about stakeholder capitalism and inclusive capitalism. And so in that sense, it isn't, again, to say that the entrepreneur is somehow going to solve the problems that we have with a capitalist model that can be very exploitive of people on the planet, but it plays an important role to pioneer new ideas, to innovate, to maybe reach markets that larger, more established business models can't. And to me, the question is always, how do we bridge between the entrepreneur, the large corporation, and sort of civil society and governance? So there'll always, in my mind, be a need for innovators, entrepreneurs, people who build businesses. They do drive jobs. They do drive inclusion, but they're fitting into a more complicated picture now.
Definitely. One of the questions we got a lot in Jamaica was, why would I fund an entrepreneur when I could fund a hospital or a school? Entrepreneurs are supposed to be in the business of generating profits, right? So why would they need my funding? And we always had to make the case that in an emerging market where the economy has been stagnant for a long time and where there are significant barriers to capital and to scaling for people who try to start something in that environment, funding entrepreneurship is a public good. And actually, economic growth is what's going to lift everyone out of a dark situation, right? So we had to tell that story, but sometimes it didn't connect because the need is so great in all these other areas.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think more and more people are making the connection when you look at the links between poverty and lack of access to formal employment. You look at underemployment among youth, among women. It's pretty clear that if you can find drivers of employment and models for bringing people into the economy, that, you might not have the same challenges you would see in terms of access to healthcare and education, because a lot of those services can be simply out of reach for people that are not even participating in the economy.
Yeah, exactly. So we have a comment here from Jay. Jay, I think, is based in Atlanta. So Jay thinks we'll see change. Hopefully companies keep the DEI conversation going forward in the years to come. So this was on our earlier conversation around whether it's just lip service or whether we're really going to see change in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space in the philanthropic world. So I wanted to ask you, Yasmina, so the Business Roundtable came out in 2019 with this new definition of the purpose of a corporation. And I had a second podcast episode this month after yours where I kind of explained philanthropy versus nonprofits versus impact investing versus social entrepreneurs. I just explained what all of those meant. And I ended by talking about the Business Roundtable, who is now saying that the purpose of a corporation is not just profit anymore. It is all the stakeholders. It is people and the environment as well as profit. So we've lived and breathed this our entire careers, but now it looks like all businesses are shifting to have some social impact now, right? Is this something that you're seeing? Like, should all businesses now be in the impact space?
I mean, that would be great. What's interesting is that the Business Roundtable is a membership organization, and that statement needed to be signed off on by its members. So it was a really powerful moment to have all those companies. It's a US-based organization, and the signatories are US-based companies, which is interesting because I think in some ways that language is much further along in Europe. And so what was kind of revolutionary to see in the United States is something that I think many companies in Europe are already on board with, and frankly face a lot more, I think, regulatory encouragement to play a more active role in sort of balancing out these different stakeholder needs. But the reality I think we saw in the pandemic is that there was a lot of variety in how companies responded in terms of protecting their employees and responding to the crisis. And so I think it's aspirational. I think it's a tremendous aspiration. And what I've been enjoying is seeing Just Capital, which is an organization that really looks at the public, looks at the American public to understand what are some of the big issues that are most material to Americans in terms of business purpose and building a more stakeholder-based capitalism. And so the issues that are coming up right now have a lot to do with the dignity of work, livelihoods, wages, living wages, because I think there's a huge level of insecurity in this country, and it's been exacerbated by the pandemic. So, I think the proof is in the pudding, and I think it's a great moment for people to find the right ways to match the rhetoric with the ways that they operate as businesses. So we're seeing positive change, but I think we're far from the day where we can say that, every business is truly building its business strategy around the different stakeholders that they're accountable to.
Definitely.
One step at a time.
Yeah, definitely. So I wanted to pause here to remind everyone, please ask us your questions. That's what we're here for, to engage with you, because you listen to the podcast. It's actually one of our most listened to episodes ever, because we have so many personality types that are interested in social impact. A lot of people are wondering, how can I get out of the corporate just focusing on profit and get into the mission, people, planet space? So ask us your question, guys. That's what we're here for. So Yasmina, I'm going to throw that question to you. How can someone get out of just business for business, squeezing every last dollar out of the corporation? How can they move from that into an impact role?
I think it's a great question. I mean, my hope will be that within companies, there's millions of ways to have impact, and you don't necessarily have to be looking for that role within the corporate foundation or the sustainability team, that it's embedded in how companies think about the way they operate and the products they design. There's a really powerful movement, and we've been looking for ways to get more involved as an organization at Acumen in terms of social entrepreneurship, and recognizing that sometimes the biggest way to have impact is by creating change within an institution, and particularly within a corporation. So I think with the backing of something like the statement of the roundtable and this idea of stakeholder capitalism to really help push those conversations, there's a number of programs now that are designed to help entrepreneurs who face, I would say, challenges as daunting as those of a social entrepreneur, because they're trying to make change where there can be systems and entrenched interests that will resist that change. If you play by the rules in the system, you win. Mm-hmm. And when you want to change those rules, there's a potential loss, and that can be threatening. So the entrepreneurship movement, and I would encourage people to look at this program. There's a couple, but one is Unusual Pioneers, which is supported by the Unis Social Business, which is really a way for people to get the tools, the networks to really develop as impact entrepreneurs, as well as the League of Entrepreneurs, which has a conference coming up in June. And there's a whole community of people that have asked themselves that same question. How can I become a change leader from within my corporation? Yeah. People are not alone in that journey, even if they feel that they are, because they might be surrounded by colleagues that are just not necessarily on that same path of transformation, but they're definitely not alone in the world, because this is a huge and growing movement. And again, hopefully for Acumen, though we are not a corporation ourselves, we want to think, how do we make the tools that we can offer, the insights that we've learned, resources like the book that our founder published, Manifesto for a Moral Revolution, which is just a handbook for people who want to create change and do the inner work as well as the work within their community to create change that's meaningful. So there's a lot to offer, but the biggest thing I would say is for people that are inside a corporation driving for change, not to think that they have to leave to create that change, because that may be the place they can have the biggest impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be ideal in a lot of these entities, but from the work that I've done with my clients, a lot of these corporations create a space where it feels impossible for the person who wants to create change to actually navigate that labyrinth. And it feels like they're blocked when they try to voice the changes that they want to make. Yeah. So often my mantra is that a toxic, and not all these environments are toxic, but some are. A toxic work environment will change you before you change it. That's often what I have to tell my clients, because they find themselves, their self-esteem being crushed sometimes in these environments. So in that regard, sometimes if you're in an environment like that, it would be nice to work with a fantastic organization like Acumen. The Branson Center saved me from the finance world, very masculine, testosterone-driven finance world.
Yeah, but it was their loss.
Right. So sometimes you can be a social entrepreneur, and it's amazing when that happens. Some of my clients have been able to do that and really create change. And sometimes you do have to leave to really spread your wings too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, again, one of those things where, so much of our messaging now is directed at leaders, because that's really where the change needs to happen. And it's not just saying to everyone, bottom up, make the change. These are hierarchical organizations. And so it's often teaching those skills of listening and breaking down sort of barriers and lines of difference that would allow leaders to let in more of the creativity, more of the thinking of people in their organization, so that they don't feel pushed out or silenced. But I do think that kind of leadership does need to come from the top. And so choosing an organization where you sense that culture, that real respect and interest in diverse perspectives, I think is really important. Besides what's in the impact report or the sustainability statement, is there a real culture of listening and openness to ideas?
Absolutely. And when you're in an environment that you feel embraces all of who you are and what you want to do in the world, you really just light up in a different way at work. Yeah. And I know one of the things that you love to do that makes you light up, Yasmina, is travel, right? I remember before COVID, you were traveling like once a week or every couple of weeks to
once a month, but it was still awesome.
Far-flung places in the world, and now that has stopped. So tell us a little bit about how travel, what is the role that kind of travel had in the space that you're in? Like, why did you have to travel so much? And how is that changing now coming out of the pandemic?
That's a great question. I mean, in some ways it's been sort of an impossible dream, so I don't think about it too much because it's just something I can do about it. But there's been more conversations lately as we see kind of a light at the end of the tunnel. How will we come back to some of those old ways of working? Because I think people will be more judicious about travel. And we're thinking about, where does it really make a difference? And I would say there's two things that I really miss and that I want to get back to. One is to just have that experience of stepping outside of your comfort zone and what's familiar, and being able to kind of shift your perspective on the world as much as you can. So I had the opportunity to take groups of corporate leaders to visit with our companies and to be in forums that we designed to really break down some of those boundaries, help people understand what is the experience of a social entrepreneur, what is the experience of a corporate executive. And those are some of my best memories, visiting a company that is helping to build transparency and equity into agricultural supply chains, and visiting a farmer who's bringing milk to be weighed on a digital scale and watching how that information was going to be transferred. Just to see the light go off in the eyes of some of our corporate partners at the power of technology to really support smallholder farmers. That was amazing. And it reminded me that, I could have sent them reports and even, videos to explain this work. But because they were standing with the farmer who they saw bringing the milk on a bicycle from a distance and then weighing it and getting the receipt that they could take to the bank, it just made a huge, huge difference. And, I was really lucky. I got to take my children actually to visit Kenya with me and to visit an organization. And I realized that ability to have greater proximity to the issues that we're interested in can start at any point and at any level of understanding. And so to see what they observed and what they witnessed, which was more than anything else, noticing the other children, noticing the smiles. I was like, oh my gosh, there's broken glass everywhere and there's no sewage system here. And my children, if they fall, because it was like flooding and the water was flooding through the street, I'm like, I might have to take them straight to a hospital because there may have been cholera in this community. And my daughter was just noticing all the little girls that would smile as her as she walked by. She was seeing something different. And so, again, I think it's just that willingness to look at the world differently, to have your perspective challenged, to see what makes you uncomfortable, and to just be in that space. I don't think there's a substitute for being in person. And then the other one is what happens in the in-between times. So I travel a lot for work to just sit and have meetings with people, which now I'm kind of like, I could do that over Zoom. But there's something that happens like right before the meeting or right after the meeting or at a dinner that happens informally, where you start to form those human connections and build trust that allows you to have a different conversation. That's been lost. It's really hard to create that informality when you're doing these little box conversations. And so I miss it. And I hope that we can find ways to create that sense of human connection without necessarily having to fly all over the planet. When we do have our conferences again, I think that the kind of buzz and excitement that people will have to be together is going to be massive.
Absolutely. And we have a question from Jordan, or a comment. Hey, ladies. Hi, Jordan. I'm really enjoying this live so far. Woo! As I prepare to transition into more of a diplomatic career, I was wondering just how effective I can be in this time. Hearing your perspective helps. Thank you, Jordan. So what about diplomacy? Do you have any thoughts on diplomatic careers in the age of COVID, Yasmina?
I can't say that I have too much perspective on that. I feel like I came from a family of diplomats because my grandfather and uncles on my mother's side all worked for the UN. And I do feel that these international organizations and diplomatic organizations play a really important role in sort of making sure that different voices are heard and the right conversations happen. But I kind of went a different path, definitely inspired by that sort of international lens, but not so much on the diplomatic front. So, philosophically, I feel like everybody has their role to play. But more and more, I think if people ask themselves, not only how can they shine in the space that they want to be in, but how are they helping to bridge, right? How are they connecting the field of diplomacy to the field of, market-based strategies or the private sector? And I think a lot of that is already happening. It's something that we see with a lot of the big institutions like USAID or UK Aid, that they're seeing themselves in this role of bridging between governments, entrepreneurs, private sector, and investors. So I think it's a changed world and much less siloed than it used to be.
Absolutely. And I've been thinking a lot about these negotiations around the vaccine distribution. For us who are not based in the US or the UK, it's very hard for our governments to get vaccines. And the role of diplomacy in the Caribbean is we're really seeing it happen now, where some Caribbean countries negotiated bilateral agreements with India and so on before ours did. We were waiting on COVAX. Now COVAX is at risk because some of the larger countries are hoarding vaccines. So it's a big diplomatic, no names being called, and it's not the only one. So there is a huge need for diplomatic channels right now just to get life-saving drugs into the countries that are outside the major blocks, right?
Yeah.
So Jordan, now more than ever before, diplomacy is needed, and good luck to you as you transition into that career.
Yeah. Well, and another issue just related to that is around climate. You look at issues like climate, and these are not issues where unilateral decision making are going to help us address the problem. And so negotiating, working across lines, and nationally and globally is going to be the only way that we come through that crisis.
Right. And on the latest episode that I mentioned to you, Yasmina, we start by saying that government is the biggest player in the social impact space still. So if you want an impact career, oftentimes a lot of us around the world think about government first as the place to go to have impact. And now that business is playing more in the space, there's more opportunity in the private space to have an impact career, but government still is the largest player in this space, right?
Absolutely.
So when you were talking about travel and what's being missed, I had wanted to jump in on that and say that is how we met at a conference, sitting at a dinner table, building trust, just talking to each other side by side. And that makes me, I think I'll travel a lot less post-COVID as well, but conferences in particular on Zoom and on Hopin, that is not the same by any stretch of the little sidebar conversations, the people that you meet just sitting next to them at a dinner table, that has been completely lost with Hopin. So I think conferences are going to make a big comeback in the real world when we all get vaccinated.
I think they will. And I think that, the layers of cocktail parties will just be overwhelming. But I think it's just recognizing that, again, we're whole people. And even in our Zoom world, I think we've begun to see more of that creeping in, to see someone with their dog running through or a baby sitting on their lap. I was just on a call earlier today with someone who was finishing a hike, and I got to see where he was. And I think that's also going to help us bring more of that humanity into our business conversations. But again, it doesn't substitute for, say, going on a hike with someone after a great session at a conference.
Definitely. So I have one last question for you. So if you guys have questions for Yasmina, get them in now. We'd love to hear from you. So Yasmina, we did not touch on this at all in our episode, but I really wanted to, which is balancing this C-level career with home life, right? You're a wife, you're a mother of two, right? Two. Or is it three? Two.
Just
two.
Right.
Exactly. So, and that's kind of what I remember we were talking about at the dinner table, you, me, and Eleanor Allen, who's the CEO of Water for People. We were all talking about this. What are your thoughts on balancing it all in the age of COVID as a C-level executive?
Gosh, so many thoughts. I feel like we could talk about that for hours and hours. I think for me, it's meant different things at different times. And I remember the first time I was asked to talk about this was as I was just finishing my first maternity leave. And I was part of a salon, a sort of multi-generational salon for women. And I was putting on high heels for the first time in 4 months. And it was this perfect metaphor for balance. So if you're trying to balance, you really can't stand still. Balance is not a rock sitting on the ground. It's something that is sort of, could fall either way. And so it's very dynamic. And what it means for you at different points in your life can change. And so for me personally, and I think it is super personal, no one can ever tell you, even though they may try, what's the right balance, how much time to spend on your family versus your work, and even what those other priorities should be. I think for women who don't have children, either because they can't, don't want to, haven't started yet, they have a life too. They have health, mental health, family members, parents. So I think, and it's not just women, it's men who increasingly are thinking about their lives more holistically. Whatever that means, it's completely personal, and the world will weigh in, whether it's coworkers or friends or parents or your spouse, and to find that individual confidence of your own vision of what your life should be, what's important to you, how you want to spend your time, having the courage of your conviction around that, to me is like the first step. Then making it work is really hard. And there's all kinds of great books written on the topic. But I think just that starting point of creating your own definition of success is really key. Because the one thing I'll say for for a woman who works, it's so easy to fall into the trap of just feeling inadequate all the time. Because you could be working harder and you could be spending more time with your kids. And even self-care can be a trap because you're like, I'm not really taking care of myself. I'm not even good at that. And it's such a waste of energy. And if you can say, look, here are the things that are important to me, I'm going to do my best. I think that's half the battle.
Absolutely. I can just jump in here and say that as someone who doesn't have kids, I live in my own apartment during COVID, and we're going into lockdown in Jamaica this weekend as well, another lockdown period. I can say that balance for me is reminding myself to stop working because I have enough time to work all the time. And I did that in February, and I really burned myself out in February doing that. So this month I've just had to be very intentional about let's stop now so that you don't burn out and go into like zombie mode.
Yeah.
Right, too often. And that's also balancing work and life. Even if you don't have a husband or kids, it's still important to stop working and have other elements come into play.
Completely. And I think it's something that serves people well, kind of as they go through their lives, to have established those boundaries for themselves, things that they value, that they care about, that are not dictated by work. But I do think it's been really tough in the pandemic. You know, people are working from home and they're working on their phones, and to create those spaces and those moments of now I'm working, now I'm not.
Right, exactly.
In some ways it's easier, and I appreciate that I have, you know, kids that force me, for better or for worse, to be like, I have to go physically get them now. And so I have to stop working. I have to take a walk. And if I didn't have that, I can see myself just having this tunnel vision and saying, there's always more, there's always more. And it's, again, it's a trap because there's something lost when you don't create those spaces for the different complex facets of what a human being is. This one idea I've been thinking about is this sort of redefining what it means to have it all, because I think we're working with a really outdated idea that women could be lucky enough to be moms if they wanted to, and also have really demanding jobs and just basically pile on responsibilities, versus a different definition, which is to have the luxury of knowing who you are, what you value, and building all those things into your life. So, you know, whether that means that you're also an artist, or you're also a dancer, or you also prize being a good friend to those in need, that's got to be a part of the definition.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I just started salsa lessons on YouTube.
Oh, that's amazing.
Just have more creativity and not just be so laser focused at work, gym, home all the time, but to spice it up a little bit. I love that. So thank you so much, Yasmina, for joining us live. And thank you guys who were on live with us. Listen to the podcast episodes this month if you want to learn more about the social impact space. And how can people reach you, Yasmina, if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. LinkedIn works really well. I feel like that's become my social media rabbit hole, because there's so many great conversations going on there and people reach out. So definitely you can follow me on LinkedIn. I try to post job opportunities, interesting articles, and reach out.
You actually just posted one this morning from the World Economic Forum, which looks really cool for those of you wanting to get into the space. There's a job opening from the World Economic Forum that Yasmina posted on her LinkedIn this morning.
Absolutely.
All right. So thank you so much, Yasmina. Thank you for those of you who are on live, and we'll see you next month.
See you. Great to see you.